Hello and good evening, everyone. We are here with Daniel Robbins, and it's a pleasure to have you all here to really this time deep dive into some very important topics for XR design, or in general, how to design UX and UI for XR application. So I would say that first I'm gonna give a short floor to Daniel to introduce himself. But most importantly, what I would like also to do is to invite everybody that joins to actually ask questions. Because actually Daniel confirmed me if I'm not mistaken, because he said yes, I would love to get questions because that's what gets actually the good vibe going. So I might ask some, but please, if you have some, go ahead. Uh, yes, I see Bowen ask, can we have this recording of this later? Yes, everybody that subscribed will certainly receive an email. But that doesn't mean that you should leave because then you can all ask questions. So for everybody, don't leave really, because I think it's a unique opportunity. We have done this in the past actually, and there were some very valuable conversation and back and forth between Daniel and the other participants. And look, I'm not saying because I want you to be here, but it's just because it's a good opportunity. It's not something that happens every day. So without further ado, Daniel, why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm been lucky enough to been working in the field of, I don't know if you want to call it XR, AR, VR, MR, whatever you call it, immersive embodied experiences. I started in the early 90s doing that work, and most recently I spent 3 years at HTC, makers of the Vive, where I worked on Premiere, both incubations and products around AR and VR. Main observation I have is that unlike 2D design, unlike say for phones and desktop, there aren't good tools. The tools are not at the level of maturity that we need yet for XR. So it's very exciting to be working with Tvori to help them shepherd along their tool so that it becomes really well geared to people who are trying to actually do iterative design. Iterative design is when you really want to try out different aspects of the design, both on yourself and other people before you commit to code. And let's jump in. I'm going to switch to some slides and just to give you some feedback, some information on me and where I come from.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the people joining, so the way this is gonna look, it's more or less the following. So Daniel will show his crafty approach, as you can see from already the slides that are in full screen right now. But then also he's going to actually really share some of his knowledge and some of his recommendation on how he is tackling this kind of challenge. And in this case, one specific, how to separate content from UI and the different importance that technique. After that, we'll also get like hands-on experience from his own perspective of doing design work within the virtual reality environment in Tvori. So that's basically how it's going to look like. Daniel, go ahead.
Cool. I'm going to go quite quickly because there's a lot to cover. I apologize if I speak too quickly, but again, this is a very fertile field for new discoveries. So background to me, I'm a sculptor by training who has been working on high tech. I've been doing this VR thing for quite a while. This is me with a terrible fashion sense and hair in the 90s doing that early VR. But then much more recently, still the devices are primitive, but I have less hair. But we keep doing this interesting work. But let's jump in and talk specifically about some of the hard topics around distinguishing your content from your interface. So there are so many different things we can talk about with XR design. These are just some of them. I'm not expecting to go into any of these actually today, except for the one around UI versus content. We've decided that is one of the areas that many people getting grounded in this area need the most input and some guidance. So let's talk about that. So specifically, when we think about a lot of VR content, it's actually quite complex in terms of the 3D contours and the 3D geometry and the interactions that are expected. So it's a challenge to figure out where do we show the interface and how should that appear. If we think about the real world and when we have objects that we interact with and that we change, we often have labels on these objects. And, there's a challenge in the real world of where these labels go so that they're both readable, but that they don't obscure what you're actually trying to interact with. As we move through the physical world, there are lots of lessons we as designers can take. Where do you put signs? Where do you put things that I need to interact with? Are they where my site is? Are they where my site will be? Likewise, people often need to be able to deal with what we call a working set, which is a small number of things that we need to keep cycling through and compare. But the problem and the tension in this, whether it be in the real world or VR, is often that working set can get in the way of the actual content. So there's a tension there. Likewise, we find that in the real world, sometimes we are telling people what they can and can't do. We're used to this in video games where there might be bounds and places you can't go beyond. But what I ask designers when you're doing VR is, if you're finding that you're telling people they can't do something, then maybe that thing shouldn't even be there in the first place. So keep that in your head as to what things should be hidden and what should be shown.
Can you make an example, Danny? Sorry, can you make an example of this specific example? So if you are here, what is that you would say? Well, if rather not put it at all instead of telling them not to use it for something in XR. Could you give an example?
Sure. So imagine an interface. Say you're doing a training example where you're teaching someone how to use physical tools using digital proxies, and you have all the different parts laid out on a virtual table, but some of them you haven't actually enabled yet. The problem is if people see all of these high fidelity objects, they want to go and grab them, they want to manipulate them, and when they can't, you really destroy the illusion. So try to remove things from the scene that aren't actually interactive, that don't have degrees of freedom with them. That's one of the general examples.
Okay.
Another thing you'll notice is what is the right way to communicate bounds and enclosures. Often we just put up labels about things, but really what we want to do is have graphical cues that outline objects, that show selection, that show relationships between objects. And I'll get into this when I jump into the tool very shortly. But here I'm really just calling out, these are some of the gotchas that happen when doing XR design around distinguishing the content. Likewise, really try to concentrate with great care as to when you're going to show the actual interface. If you show it too late, people are already getting themselves in situations where they can't actually manipulate things in the way they want to. So an example in XR might be if you are, as you move a tool toward selecting an object, but you only give them feedback when they selected the object at the exact moment of selection, that requires too much hand-eye coordination. Instead, you want to give proximity cues. You want to show people cues as they're moving closer toward things to cue them up, to help them understand what is about to happen. Again, also understand if there are things in the environment that are potentially destructive that you don't want them to interact with, or they have to be very careful how they interact with, put them out of harm's reach. Put them in a place where it is hard for people to get them or require extra steps to be able to interact with them. Also think about context. This is an electronic sign in a subway. It happens to be in New York, and one of the things that's wonderful about this is it's showing you selection, in other words, where you're at in the context of all the other stops. Imagine if you were on the train and it only said exactly where you are, but you had no idea how many stops to when you get off. Now extend that to the idea of XR and think about when someone's doing a multi-step process. You really want to give them at least an idea of context of where they are, not in the entire process necessarily, but the general neighborhood, adjacent proximal neighborhood of when they're doing interactions. And I'll try to show that in some of the examples as well. Also be very aware of abstraction. Many of us designers have grown up in an age where we like to have very abstract icons. We like to remove any skeuomorphic cues. The problem with that in VR is that it becomes very difficult to actually understand what we're telling the end user with that abstraction. So we really need to hold people's hands in these early stages of immersive design. In some sense, less is less right now in VR. So we have to really be careful to have specific information that's timely, in that does not obscure the content at the same time. Likewise, be sensitive to, are you showing someone multiple ways of doing the same thing? Because that can be very confusing. Here in the real world, this happens to be in an elevator. There's a sign that is telling you what this blinking light does. In VR, if you're designing something like this, well, the light itself can be the indicator of what it does. You don't need additional outside labeling or interactive elements. Think about how the elements themselves can communicate what they do. And lastly, let people know why things are there. Why is this shelf here? Well, this shelf here is to hold drinks, so they give you an image. So likewise, if I'm in a VR application and I've got UI, tell people why that interface is there. Tell people what they're going to do with it and why they should get, what the value of using those particular elements are. I'm going to jump forward at this point to show some illustrative videos that I actually created directly in Tvori. While I'm doing that, Gabrielle, do you have any questions?
I will interrupt. And actually, you see, guys, that's what I was telling you. So we are really waiting for those questions. So please, if you see, like, yeah, I've encountered that, but how have you solved that problem about, for example, in a specific case on explain what that UI is for. Again, so please just don't hesitate, ask questions, and we really want them. So I'm gonna be very sad if nobody does. So let's take it like that.
Okay. So what I previously showed was a lot of sort of high-level concepts and high-level guidance. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show some pre-recorded video from within Tvori to give you an idea of the kind of design work I do when I'm actually working on interface design in XR. So here you'll see a prototypical kind of environment, and I'm looking at some interface elements, and I'm trying to see how do these show up against the background. And I'm already seeing some issues and some problems. So you'll see the windows in the background are this bright white, which happens to be the same as the white cues that I'm using on the interface elements. So what I'll instead do is I'll create a whole bunch of different versions, and I'll look at those against the background, and I'll see, well, what are the trade-offs in readability, in contrast, space utilization, how much space does each one of these take up? If I extend this even further, what I next do when I'm designing one of these sets of interface elements is I'll then check it against different kinds of backgrounds and different scenes, because a design kit has to work in multiple examples. So here's a photogrammetry background, and I'm looking to see, well, what's the difference, what's the trade-off between having a light background and a dark background? When do these show up well? When do they not show up well? And I'm getting in really close, and I'm checking again boundaries, readability of text, how do they work at different distances? And you'll notice as I move farther back, it's much harder to see the text, and that's an important learning. If there's information I want to convey, it has to be large enough for people to read it, but then there's that tension with which of the content is it going to obscure.
So
I'm
in this case,
very careful when I'm setting up these test scenes to make sure that there's animation, so that there's distractions. I really want to get away from having an idealized version of these design problems.
So in this case, what you mentioned is basically experimentation. So like put yourself early on in the design in different setting to discover what works, what doesn't work. And is this something that you do alone or something that you do also with other people, out of curiosity?
Oh, I mean, ideally before the pandemic, we were all in a studio together and we could look over each other's shoulders or try on each other's headsets. The times are different now, so it becomes a more occasional thing of sharing. But yes, different people on the team have different skill sets. Mine might be around interactivity. I have coworkers who are amazing at visual design, and I really lean on different people for their different expertise.
Yeah. So it's not just a single work where you just do it, but it's whenever possible, gather others and try to share this early on in the design.
Right. Stepping in here, so you noticed in the previous video, I was really looking at how do I show these panels against different backgrounds. Now what I'm mostly interested in this particular demonstration is how does the representation of this panel change depending on where it is in space. So if it just needs to be a small annotation about an object, if it's far away, then what I might do is have a much more compact representation because I want to give more attention to the environment. So all of the UI here is adaptable, it's responsive. So as it changes the amount of attention it gets, it changes what it looks like.
So I do have a question in the meantime. So when designing UI, do you have a background in graphic design, or do you collaborate with that?
I collaborate with visual designers. Again, that is not my superpower, the visual design. Again, my main focus is on interactivity, which is when do you show people information? How do they activate that information? An example might be, say you want a virtual keyboard to appear in your VR setting. When would that appear? What causes it to activate? Is it just looking down? Is it your hands moving in a certain posture? Those are the kinds of problems that I find most interesting.
Okay. And I also do have another question. You're welcome, Sean. Pleasure. John also asked, interested in guidelines for when an interface should be completely 2D versus having depth and 3D elements beyond flashiness. Beyond
Sure.
flashiness. So when should be?
I can answer that pretty well. So just give a little background. So when I started doing 3D UI design work, and this is in the, let's say around the early 90s, we were doing lots of design of 3D interfaces. At that time, we had this fantasy that all interfaces, when you're in 3D content, should be 3D, and we put everything in the scene, all buttons, all labels, all sliders, and everything. The problem was it's really not an efficient use of space for abstract manipulation. So I would say that the real test is, does the interface that you're presenting gain anything from being spatially located? In other words, if it's an interface element that's referring to a sub-object in the scene that's in a location, and the location matters and that correspondence matters, then yes, there should be some cue that should be in 3D. If instead it's more abstract, like say it's just a long list of parameters, then 2D, floating in space is actually quite efficient. People already know how to use that. UI toolkits are better accommodated for doing that. So be very careful about when you start throwing an interface into 3D. Other kinds of problems happen when you start putting interfaces at an angle. Imagine you have like a slider, a standard 2D slider, but then you cant it in space. It now becomes much harder to manipulate because it's at an acute angle to the user. Text also has some deep readability problems when you start changing the angle of the text in 3D. So when you can, try to pull the interface into 2D. If you need to show correspondences to objects that are spatially located, then what you want to do is have very sparse cues. Think of them sort of highlight cues and maybe lines that connect those cues back to the abstract information that's in a 2D UI. When you can, try to do things like have curves on those lines that connect them so that they pop out from the background. When you can, develop a visual language that distinguishes the UI from the content. And also, as soon as you can remove those correspondences and those highlights from the world, try to get rid of them. They should only be there when you need to know that information. So think of it as being an on-demand interface.
Yeah.
By
So
analogy, if you were in a car and your car had a head-up display and was showing you all the information in the world and it was showing you all Starbucks coffee shops, that would be completely overwhelming. Just think about the exact one thing that they need to see at any moment. You're not always going to get it right. So what you can do is you can also use fall-off functions. A fall-off function is where you highlight things with different degrees of saliency. So some things are brighter and then it falls off depending on how far you are from a locus of interest.
Understood. And I think it was a pretty extensive answer, and I believe this was a question from John. Got him. So I hope that was, and there's still other question coming. So another one is, for example, from Alessandro Trezzi. Ciao, Alessandro. How do you actually specify the elements, the size of the UI? And this is something that actually was in that video to some extent, right? Because you did. Maybe you can share it again and answer that question with that, because that seemed part of the picture in that case.
And so I do want to call out saying that size is a very strange beast when you're in 3D. You know, we talk about the view frustum, which is that mythical pyramid that extends out from the viewer's eyes. And let me share my screen. So as you know, with the view frustum, if I have something that's small but is close to me, it appears large. If I make it very large but move it farther away, it's effectively the same. It doesn't really matter in terms of which model you're using. The reason you might want to change whether it's actually small in object space in the units is so that you have more flexibility about where you place it. So in general, I tend to make my UI small when I can, but put it pretty close, because that gives me a lot more flexibility. So I don't have to dynamically manage both size and placement. In general, I will put things as far away as I can, but still have them readable. And the reason is because the farther away they are, the less of the content I'm obscuring.
So yeah,
but I am also careful as things are moving closer and farther away from the viewer. I do tend to change the representation. Think of this as like a reactive web page. You know, if I look at something on a small device, it has a certain representation. As I move it farther away, then it has a different representation. So let's show that again, so that as these elements are close, they have a fairly detailed appearance. So let me skip to the next one. So this shows it a little bit better. So
yeah,
it's a detailed appearance, but when then I move it farther away from the viewer, it gets smaller. You also, I want you to notice another subtle behavior here. As I move my view, the interface follows what we call a tag-along behavior. So it's not head-locked and it's not world-locked. It's somewhere in between. So generally it's locked to the world, but if I move my head, then it scoots along to follow me with a delay function.
Yeah.
Here what I'm showing in this little example is I'm experimenting with different cues to show selection. This is a very simple cue of just having a little animation around an object. Again, you have to understand what's happening in the scene behind and whether that's conflicting with the cue. That was not an effective cue. Here I'm using a simple flashing technique, which is better because that kind of flashing is not happening in the environment itself. You can imagine though, say there was a street light in the scene and that street light was also flashing. Well, then that is now a visual channel that I can't use in my interface. So it's a game of cat and mouse where I have to think about what are all the different kinds of cues that might be happening in my content and which ones are left for me as a designer.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not just about size, right? It's about size in relationship to content, it's size in relationship to use, to function. So I don't think that it's possible just to say how big should be. I think it depends, and it's an answer that probably is not going to make anybody happy. But
no, I mean, I can give a more specific answer. The size very much relates to what degree you want to show spatial correspondences. In other words, if I have a label and it's really important that that label is sitting on top of a modeled piece of geometry or something in the real world in the AR setting, then it has to have a scale that is coincident with the objects in the real world or in the modeled world. In other words, if I'll show, let me switch back to this video, that'll actually show it pretty well. So in this example, I have a virtual control panel, and I have some annotational information that appears in the app. So these control panels are the content in some sense. And then I have another piece of UI that's going to appear over them that is the app that is letting me have higher level control. But it's really important that the UI I present lives in the 3D world for multiple reasons. If it's big like this, it's obscuring everything. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to shrink this way down. and I'm going to place it very carefully so that it's only it only obscures things that aren't important for the current task. I'm also dynamically rearranging interface elements so that they fit into hopefully the white spaces that I can find in my world.
Yeah.
So these interface elements are actually quite small. Here, if I back up, you can see they're small and they're living in the scene. There are times when they may not relate to something that's happening in the scene, and then I can make them larger. But as soon as I zoom in, then they get small again, and I see the correspondence to objects in that in the model geometry.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I'm asking another question that doesn't necessarily relate, but it was upvoted twice. So I think it's people would like to know, and is this one: what are the metrics KPI considered while user testing an immersive interface?
So there's there's multiple dimensions, ways to answer this. The first one is actually what is the emotional state of the user when they're using the application. And it depends greatly whether this is a subject matter expert that you're testing, whether it's someone who's ever used VR before, whether it's someone who's going to be using it just once and then coming out, or they're going to be using it for 8 hours a day in an intensive training. But for all of those, across all of those, the most important characteristic that I'm always looking for is their emotional state. Are they feeling unsettled, or are they feeling a sense of trust? The most important part is trust. And again, I'm not assuming we're not talking about games here. We're talking about productivity or enterprise applications. So if people have to have an idea that when they expect something from the experience, that expectation is going to be met. So I, as a designer, when I'm running a test, when I have people in the lab, one of the things I'm often doing before I even have them play with anything in the environment is I have them look around and I ask them pretty open-ended questions. And this is all on the qualitative side. I will ask them, what are you expecting to see? What do you think you can do right here? Which things in this environment do you think you can touch? Which things in this environment do you think you shouldn't touch? And then say I have tasks that I want them to accomplish. Before even asking them to start doing it and manipulating their hand, I'll ask them to describe their own model. So say I'm creating a surgery simulator and I need them to, snap an attachment onto, some specialized tool that the surgeon would be using in VR. Rather than saying, okay, go do it and seeing how my interface works, I'll first say, okay, you see some elements laid out on the table here. How do you think you would put them together? And at that point, my job as a designer is to really listen very carefully to the language they're using, the actual words. Because they might say things like, well, I'm going to pick it up. Well, when they say pick it up, that language suggests that they feel their hand should go to the tool as opposed to the tool comes to them. If they say something like, well, I might open a menu. Well, I might think that's inefficient, but that's their concept. And you wouldn't get that if you immediately just leap into the task. So that's the first part of doing the studies. The second part is when you're actually running the task, when you're saying, okay, I need you to snap on this surgical attachment, and I need you to then, pick up this object and put in this other place. At that point, what I'm really looking for is when are they moving from hand to hand? When are they re-gripping the controller in different ways? And I'm also trying to really find out when are they missing. Are they trying to grab something and I notice that they're making multiple attempts? That's a very interesting thing to record. And if I think about KPIs, I will often think about missed attempts. It's not necessarily time on task because I'm okay with someone taking longer, but what's much more important to me is if they keep missing, then their frustration level, then their emotional state is going to be negative and the amount of trust I have is going to be compromised. So I, again, think about the degree to which what is happening in the world meets their own internal model, even if their internal model in some sense is incorrect. What that teaches me is if they have an incorrect model, that the next time that I design the interface, I'm going to have to change it so it either matches their model or I'm going to have to communicate with them before they step into the task what the actual model in the system is. So that was a very long-winded answer. The main takeaway is the most important KPI is emotional state of the user.
Yeah.
Second most important thing to look at is frustration level and missed attempts.
Yeah. I think there is a lot to chew on these guys. Uh, so I've seen some really good points. A very interesting point about missed attempts. So I think people share and knowledge. Thanks for that, Daniel.
Yeah, and sometimes we think that people are just doing less in an interface and that they're hesitant, but what actually happened is they tried something and it didn't work. And you can only know that if you're watching very, very carefully. I want to go back to the slides for a second, and I want to talk a little bit about some of these concepts again. And so I'm going to go back and forth between the abstraction of these guidelines, and then I want to jump into the tool and talk about how these kinds of things are made. So again, we when we're dealing with XR, one of the challenges is that the content can be extremely complex, whether it be a game or an architectural environment or training, or as we talked about surgery. The content, the geometry, the animations, the shading, the representations are very complex. This is very different than, say, designing an interface on a phone where the content tends to live in bounded areas. As I said, there's also a wide depth of range, which is how close things are to the user. And you noticed even in those examples I showed that were quickly mocked up in Tvori, it can be very easy to accidentally have the UI going through different elements of the environment. And I'll show you that in real time. Next things you really have to be aware of are, we talked about this, what is the size of the content that we need to highlight? Often there's great ranges. We might have a large object like, show me a highlight for this building, and then we want to show you a highlight for the flower that's in the flower box on one window on that building. So whatever UI you make has to be able to adapt between those wildly different scales that you have. And then sometimes we have multiple items and multiple things that we need to deal with and highlight, and sometimes they're also not all even in view at the same time. So imagine that I'm in VR full 360 with 6 degrees of freedom, and I ask the system to highlight every street light. Well, at that point, I'm going to have highlights of things that are behind me. So I have to think about not just how do I highlight those items, but how do I show the user that there are things to look at that are off screen. But all is not lost. There's many, many tools that we have in our tool belt as designers. Some of these are the same we might have in 2D, such as color and shape. But when we get into 3D, then we have things like shaders, which is, how does that object interact with the background behind it? Does it lighten it? Does it darken it? Does it put a glow on it? What subtle animations can help pull the UI away from the content? And what you have to do is you have to think in this content, which of these channels are already used and which are still available to me as a designer. Attachment is when are different elements, different interface elements attached to each other, and when do I show correspondence? Likewise, and I talked about some of these before, is when you can show as little as you can. We have a great habit of trying to give people lots of power, but in an immersive setting that can actually be very distracting. We also have to think about which things, and I mentioned this before, which things should be aligned to the user and which things can be aligning to the content that are behind you. At this point, I'm going to switch back to the tool, to actually Tvori. I'm going to go into Tvori in real time, if that's okay with you, or are there more questions?
Yeah, we are daring here. We do have one question from Jose. Question: when the iPhone appeared, the design trend was skeuomorphic, which it was a way. Here we go. Which was a way to bridge real world and the digital. Do you think we are going to have an AR skeuomorphic phase?
We're already there. I mean, that's where, if you look at most interfaces for AR and VR, they already are doing a lot of hand holding. If you have something that's like a button, it looks like a physical button, modeled in 3D with geometry, and you push it and the button goes in and levers. And I think that's all fine in this very early stage, because we haven't trained people yet that, that a piece of text is a link, or, a button might just be a gesture. The other thing that happened on mobile devices, if you look at some of the cutting edge tools that the youth use, like TikTok or Snapchat, a lot of the interface is invisible. It's all done through gesture, where you're dragging from off screen, or you're pinching, or you're doing something that doesn't have a visual representation. There's multiple reasons for doing that on a phone. One, the platform's been out there long enough, so people have learned how to do it. But also, there's a lot of peer teaching that happens with those platforms, where people like the gradual revealment of think of them as expert features they're buried between different hidden layers. We don't have that luxury right now in XR. Where we are in the marketplace and with limited adoption, we have to be very careful and very humble about the interface and to not shake things up yet. Right now, the experience itself of having 6 degrees of freedom and wearing this thing on your head, and you're hot and you're sweaty, that is already asking so much of the user that it is in my opinion, too much to ask them to also use very strange interface techniques. So again, a long-winded answer to say, yes, we're going through the same skeuomorphic evolution. That's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's actually expected.
Yes, and I think that with this new generation of VR natives, so people basically that have never seen a world without VR. That is also, again, right, they are gonna grow with the concept that VR is something that always existed. As such, also they will be adapted and aware and more, let's say, accustomed to a certain way of doing things, like pinching, something that is gonna be something that is normal. Everybody's gonna understand that when you pinch and drag, that is gonna result in a certain reaction in the app. So,
and to that, I mean, I'll speak a little bit. If I were to look in my crystal ball, if we actually say pinch, if we actually say the hands, I mean, as we know on newer platforms like the Quest 2 with its hand tracking, and the new HP that was revealed yesterday that has its eye tracking and facial expression tracking. I think what we're going to see with that is eventually, hopefully not too long from now, we will develop design conventions, such as, like if I open my left hand, the menu's always on my left hand. If I swipe my right hand, that means back or undo. If I say roll one finger, my thumb against my other finger, maybe that means scroll. All of those, in some sense, become invisible UI because there's no UI that's living on the screen. It's all in reaction to invisible gestures that I'm doing with my hand. We're not there yet, but I think we will build up those conventions pretty quickly as the sensing becomes more sophisticated, and it has to become reliable. If I'm trying to do a gesture like this for scroll and it works 3 times out of 5, then I'm not going to use it. It's going to be too unreliable.
Frustration goes up, and then, as we said before,
virtual keyboard using my hands to do pinch typing, and it's exhausting because my hands are up in the air, and because there's no tactile feedback. It's not a grounded interaction. At that point, I'm going to stop using that, and I want to go back to a visible UI.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So it's much more than the phones. It's much more reliant on that symbiosis between the sensing technology and how well it works, and also the user's expectations.
Yeah. So please go ahead. I'll keep track on the chat. I don't see anything coming up, so you can.
Okay, and I'm going to put on my headset. Today I happen to be using a Vive Pro running off a PC, but Tvori works equally well on quite a few platforms. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to be sort of showing you behind the scenes of how I do this work. So you'll notice a bunch of geometry here, and this is a little office that I found on Sketchfab. Sketchfab is your friend as long as you attribute all your creators. It's a great place to kit bash and pull things up. But a bunch of things, I modified this environment to really help me test a few principles. So the first one is, you notice when I created these interface elements, they have this very bright white border. And that's using the, let me see, in Tvori, that's a particular new shading technique for doing that, which is called unlit. So just to give you an idea of what I mean by unlit and how important that is for interface elements, and there's now a new UI pack. So say I take a piece of interface right here and I place it in my environment. Right now it's fully lit and shaded and shadowed like every other element in the scene, but it's very hard to know, is this a piece of interface or is this just a modern sculpture that's sitting on this desk? So what I do as a designer is I go into this tool set and I say, okay, what are the different ways that I can color this object in different kinds of materials? So now it is completely unlit, but I've lost all of the contours. So there's really a balance to be found here. And I'll just cycle through all of these. I mean, this particular shading is good because it is not a channel that's being used in the environment, but it's bad because it's also too subtle and it's too hard to see. So again, what I'll do is I'll start going through all of these different techniques. Still don't like that. I might go back to a standard one and say, okay, maybe what I'll do is I'll give it a little bit of emissivity, which means that it will glow even if the lighting is dark in the scene. So this is actually brighter than something would be in the real world, but still has some contouring and shape to it. So again, I create these test environments. I try to put as many what we think of as degenerate situations. And a degenerate situation is where you have things like bright elements in a scene, very dark elements in a scene, and I try to see how does this interface element work in different places in the scene. We also talked about size, so let me pop out here. And you'll notice, again, this is my cheat sheet. I'll take these elements and I'll move them. I'll move them and I'll put them against different backgrounds. So here we have a photogrammetry set piece, and I'll look and see, well, how does this work? And this is full opacity. Here we have some different shading techniques, and I want to see how does the text change as I move farther and back. So when I get to about here, and I don't know what it's like on Zoom for you, but when I get to about here, some of the text is still readable, but then some of it is much less readable. And what's happening here in the middle section is that there's a black outline around the text, which works very well when it's close, but when I get far, I get a lot of sort of sparkling aliasing, which makes it very difficult to read and is distracting.
I can confirm.
Some of this is graphic design, but some of it is also understanding how does Unity, which is the engine, how does Unity actually do its text rendering?
Yeah.
So different environment, just testing it against different environments. Again, another complex environment. You'll see all these little crosshairs floating in space. What those are actually proxy objects. So when I grab one of those proxy objects, it's just a way of manipulating a whole bunch of things in the scene. And you saw before I did a little animation where if I'm in this point of view, and the object moves further away, it changes its representation. All that's really happening here, if I dive in, and let me zoom into the timeline.
Yeah, so basically, just maybe also to explain people that are watching online, because they might not be as familiar with Tvori as you, Daniel. So these are all basically simulated interactions. So there is like no code. So there is nothing coded in Unity or anything. Everything is simulated using basically animation and the timeline that is built in the tool, right? So just to give a little bit of concept of background.
Right, and I can ask, and very quickly I can ask what-if questions, and as a designer, that's when things get the most interesting. So I made this element previously that you saw, this shape that has pretty good contrast with the background, but I'm going to improve it. So let me get some more geometry, just to give it some contrast. So I'm actually building my interface, like I said, in Tvori right now. I'm going to place this behind just to make it pop from the background a little bit more. Changes materials. And now what I can do is I can group these together. And I'm not expecting you all to follow every single step here, but the point is I'm doing this very quickly. In real time, I'm actually building this interface. I'm going to create a link between this object and these crosshairs. And that way, if I move this whole construct, now it moves with it. And I can go back to my animation at this point and ask myself, well, with this new element, does it still work? So I can roll forward and back, and I see, oh, there's a problem in my design, so that as this panel floats away, this element is in the wrong place. And what that tells me is I actually parented it to the wrong object. So I can break that link if I want to, or I can relink it to something else.
Yeah. Yeah. So there is Sean asking, so is this an add-on or a standalone program that operates like Unity or Unreal? No, it's a standalone program. So basically you can just download it. Actually, you can try it yourself. If you go to Tvori.com, you'll basically be able to try the free version and see and experiment yourself. It runs as Daniel said on PC VR. At the moment, so basically any Oculus, or even if you have a Quest and a VR ready PC, you can just run it and experiment and try yourself.
Right, and so what you'll notice here is this is quite empowering to me as a designer. I didn't have to do any code, I'm just using animation tools, and most designers are familiar with animation tools, but I could then give this to a developer and say, well, I want this behavior so that when the panel folds up, all these elements go away and I'm left with a simpler representation.
Yeah.
Very important at this point to always verify, though, from different points of view. So right now I have this God camera where I can move anywhere and change anything. But what I always do is I always come back and verify a view from the actual camera that the viewer, the actual user might be looking at. So something I do in Tvori for scale is I create a human maquette and I attach a camera onto the head of that maquette. So I always have a point of view which follows what a real user would see. And that's a very good way to verify, because again, in this God view, I can do anything and be like, oh, I can just go closer and farther. But that's something that's expensive to do in VR when you're actually within a real application.
Yeah, yeah. And there was also something that you mentioned about I can give this to development. Right, so you mentioned. I'm curious about. I had a question now for to the people maybe. How are you actually, if you do design, how are you handing over your design, your projects, and handing over and communicating those design with development? I'm actually really curious. Would be really curious to know and to hear what you guys, how you guys are doing it, and maybe in the meantime also Daniel, how have you been handing over some of this design? In this case, I mean, you can just export it as an FBX, so it's an animated, it keeps everything, you can just put it in Unity and you can give it. But what other ways have you used besides this to hand over and share those ideas with developers, for example?
So I'm going to pop out a headset for a second so I can talk directly to everybody.
Yes.
So I've worked on tools to create interfaces for a very long time in various places. The longest was at Microsoft, where I worked on tools for Visual Studio, which you may have heard of that. And there was always this fantasy that we were going to allow designers to create content, and then with one button they could hand it over to a developer, and the developer would just hook up all the code.
Yeah.
Turned out that was actually a fantasy, and the reason is because the way a designer conceives of an interface is very different than the way a developer conceives of it. A designer, when I'm quickly mocking up stuff like this, I am manually creating all these objects, I'm manually adding all this animation. The hierarchy in the scene is only there to support the animation and the modeling I'm doing. When a developer has an interface, an actual running interface on a real app, I don't care what platform, most of the interface is parametric. It's generated at runtime. All of the text strings are coming from, reference lookups. The hierarchy is very, very different in an actual running app than the way a designer thinks of it. So the long and short of it is, I think it's really important as a designer to think of all of these creations as throwaway. The only purpose of creating these is to tell a story and to help come to a design decision when you're working with developers and other stakeholders. Do the least amount of work to make the simplest thing so that you can arrive at a decision. That is much more important than I made a beautiful thing. It's much more important than, is this 3 pixels, and then the developer knows that it's exactly 3 pixels. That's not the hard part of doing XR design. The hard part is to really convey the motion and the interaction, and have the developer, when they see this, get so excited that they say, oh, I understand how I could do that more easily. I understand how I could wrap that up and parameterize that. So, when something moves a short distance, it has a little bounce. If it moves a far distance, it's going to have an ease in and ease out. Things that we're not going to do as a designer at a very fine detail in the animation tool, but the developer can run with. So again, the summary there is, I'm not actually going to hand over these assets. I'm not going to hand over an animation file. And that's fine, because I didn't spend days doing this. I did this in an hour.
Yeah, I agree.
Quickly possible.
Yeah, but that's the point, right? Because not everybody has access to this kind of tools, right? So is it the reality right now for the majority of the industry about saying, okay, do something in Unity, spend a lot of time, and then throw it away? Can you approach that the same way? Because it doesn't seem. You understand a bit of what I mean. So if I'm a designer, and do I have to really? Is it expected of me as a designer to do something in Unity and then throw it away, or then I should not, because that's the only thing I have, because the other option is to make drawings or something like that, right?
So first, you said Unity, and I'm talking about using mock-up tools like Tvori.
So okay.
Part of the joy of being in a designer-friendly tool is that things aren't precious anymore. If you go into something like Unity, which is not designer-friendly, and I'm good with Unity, but it's not fun for a designer to be in there. Yeah. If I'm in there, things become precious because I'm spending so much time and I'm investing so much energy on tweaking the parameters, and because there's so much control, I'm going to start thinking about, what are the constraints on this interface? Is the left edge attached to the right edge with a spring? And is it space filling? Am I using a stack panel? I'm starting to ask all these very detailed questions that get me very, very invested in what I'm making, too invested. If I try to move as much of the design decisions earlier on to a lightweight tool, then yes, I will say absolutely things should be thrown away. And when I mentor junior designers, one of the first things I tell them is, throw your work away really quickly. It only needs to live as long enough to help you make a decision or to communicate that to somebody else. After that, it's time to move on, because by the time you've tweaked every last parameter, you've already learned something new anyway, and you have to redo the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Understood. Yeah.
Okay.
Did you have anything, because we have around 5 minutes left? I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to show. Maybe we can just prompt for more questions in the last 5 minutes.
Sure, or I'm happy to jump back in the tool if people have questions. I mean, the short version of the tool, where it is at this point, this particular tool is it's a pretty fast and fluid animation and modeling tool. And when I say modeling, I mean scene construction. You're not actually creating geometry, you're arranging geometry. The real task for a designer in using these kinds of tools is, how can you simulate the point of view of an end user? How can I put myself in their shoes? I want to be in the same view they're in. I want to understand all the distractions they're going to encounter. I want to understand the complexity of the background as things animate, as they move. Say lighting is changing. That's a good one right there. I'm going to take a quick diversion and go back into the tool.
Yeah.
Talk about lighting for a second. So if I'm in the tool here, and say I'm just moving the sun, everything is changing. Every single pixel on the scene is changing right here as I do this. So often because of that, I'm going to use, interface elements that are not affected by the lighting. So here's that interface element. And if I change the sun, you notice the interface element is not, most of it is not affected by the shading.
Yes.
So in fact, as the lighting changes, it causes that interface element to pop out even more. Notice again in Tvori, I talk about always verifying what you see through the end user's point of view. So this little camera shows me what the end user would see.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, back to you.
Yeah. Sean is asking, can this program be used for data visualization in real time, similar to AWS Sumerian? My answer would be no.
Yeah, that's not the point of it. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're trying to hook up to a real data source, this is not the tool for you.
No.
What if you're trying to figure out is, say I have 5 different graphs, say I'm creating an IoT application to monitor machine health in a factory, and I want to view that with digital twins. This would be a great tool to mock up with fake data, and fake constructions, where those might live. And I would recommend, again, do it as cheap and easiest as you can. So go and do some screenshots of your data visualizations from your 2D tool, import them as images into the 3D tool, just start placing them and start to understand, well, if I take this graph and I put it at an acute angle, can I still understand what I'm seeing? And then you can start to ask other interesting questions. Say I have 2 different graphs and I make one of them semi-transparent. Now I can lay one on top of the other one and I can start to compare information. It doesn't have to be live data. It doesn't have to be pixel accurate, because what I really care about is the arrangement of space, how I move with those things, which things are world locked, which things are hand locked, which things are maybe head locked. Those are the kinds of questions that this tool will help you answer in very quick and cheap ways.
Yeah, and of course, what happens if I'm turning my head, the menus are not there? Should they disappear? Should they stay there? And all this kind of consideration that could be basically simulated, just grabbing the object around and having an impression, and then communicating that to the people around you, right? Because then you can make the video outside. So this is option 1, option 2, option 3. What do you think, guys? This would be my favorite. And then it's the moment that you can more easily then communicate that to the rest of the team, I think.
Yeah, and I do want to gently remind all of you creators out there that just because you create something beautiful and you think the user should put their attention on it, doesn't mean that's where they're going to put their attention. We created these devices with, full freedom, which means people have full freedom. They can look wherever they want to. They can go wherever they want to. And you have to be aware of that and try to move things to where people are, as opposed to asking them to move to your special baby that you created.
Yeah. Look, I mean, this would be a great way to end it, because I think it's everybody, when everybody creates stuff, of course there is this attachment, right? Disappointment when we see that this vision of is not getting to fruition, right? It's not as we intended. But yeah, absolutely. If there isn't any other question, I would like to first of all thank Daniel for really the great demonstration. And also for all the guidelines, feedbacks, and information that he shared today, in terms of and again, right, everybody can go through the recording, get back, take notes, and then use those, as well as all the answers that were in the chat.
And this is meant really just to be a tease, to get people interested and excited. Yeah. This is not a full course. It's not a full tutorial, but we're trying to show that these kinds of tools actually are in reach of pretty much anybody. If you can get a headset, then you can start designing. When I talk to designers who are trying to break into the field, or they're the first XR incubation within their larger company, the main guidance I have is just make stuff, make a lot of things. And with tools like this, you don't need a developer to make demonstrations that you can then show to stakeholders. Even though we're using all this sophisticated technology, when we're in a larger organization and we need to communicate, often it's a video that has the most life and the most legs. So I have in the past, in real work settings, in very important internal discussions, spend a few hours making the animation in a tool like this, the output of which is just an old video. It's just a standard video, but that video then can be emailed around. It can go to this person. It can cross the waters. I don't have to worry about holding someone's hand. It can stand on its own, and that has a real life and vitality to it. Just because we have these sophisticated devices doesn't mean we have to do everything with them.
Absolutely, absolutely. There is someone, Jose asked, is Daniel publishing his knowledge somewhere, video, books, or articles? What can we expect from you, Daniel?
Thanks. So first thing I would offer is, in some ways it's a very new field, the VR, even though I've been doing it for 25 years. It's still new in that we don't really have design guidelines per se. The big companies, the Facebooks, the HTCs, the Googles, they have sketches of guidelines, but they all say very obvious things like, don't let people walk through walls and stuff like that. We're really making it up as we go along at this point. There's some, very interesting work out of Stanford around developing curriculum, and out of, a school in Houston, Texas. And then the people who create the CoSpaces tool have some curricula at work, but it's really very, very early stages. So simple answer is no.
No, sorry, Jose. And I think I don't want to end up.
You can make one yourself right now using this tool. So.
Yeah, so indeed, I don't want to end with disappointing no, but that's to some extent the truth. The good news is that if anybody has a VR headset, you can just try it, right? So you can just go download it, experiment yourself, and just see how it feels. And you can, again, right, even take a screen capture of what you have done, show it around, and if you think that it's valuable, absolutely, let us know. We would like to hear your feedback. So overall, Daniel, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. I believe that many people have learned a lot. And I have learned a lot because I'm also always trying to understand how this world works. So thank you very much, and thanks everybody for being here. You're gonna get the recording, and if you have any other question, please email it to hello@tvori.com. Let's get in touch and let's start the conversation. Bye bye, guys.
Thank you all. Let's find the world together.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.